Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our monthly seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Toby Green, who is the Professor of Pre-Colonial and Lusophone African History and Culture at King's College in London. He has done extensive work on the Atlantic slave trade and the history of the Portuguese Empire. And I think one of his most famous books to come out of that research is A Fistful of Shells, which was published by Penguin. Certainly required reading for anyone interested in the period. However, Toby will not be speaking to us about the Portuguese Empire. Rather, he'll be talking to us about his other big research interest, which is inequality and COVID. He wrote a book on the subject called The COVID Consensus, which was published by Hearst. And the launch of the Dutch edition is tomorrow in Amsterdam. So the translation at 8 o'clock at Schram Studios, Gasweg 52 in Amsterdam. So if anyone is interested in the signed version, I would encourage you to come.
With my co-author.
With your co-author.
Yeah. Thomas Fatsen.
Thomas Fatsen. Yeah. So without further ado, Toby, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, John.
And can I have an applause, please?
Yeah.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much to everybody here in the live and to Rick for your help in arranging this. And I'm really pleased to be with you all here today, and to everybody online as well. Thank you for joining. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes or so. I do have a PowerPoint presentation which I'll share with you. I'm not going to just stay seated because although I think for people online it wouldn't matter too much if I did. I think people in the room, I certainly don't want anybody to fall asleep. So I will move around a bit. I have a text because I think sometimes with lectures I like to have a presentation and just talk through it, but I think with this particular topic in particular, I think it's very important to speak to a very thought out and carefully considered text, because it is an issue which I'm sure everybody who is here this evening has reflected on, and it raises many complicated and problematic issues which I think collectively in academia and far beyond academia we need to address. So I'll start with the text. Everyone who works in the field of African studies touches necessarily on the question of inequality. And as John said, that's been the main focus of my own research in the pre-colonial world. In all the fields within the discipline of African studies, political science, history, sociology, economics, law, the global history of accelerating inequality between the African continent and the global north shapes analysis and critique. But this runs, on the other hand, alongside the necessity of representing the creative response of Africa and of Africans to that structural framework of injustice and inequity, in shorthand, what we might summarize as the framework of African agency. In practice, neither approach is exclusive of the other, even if sometimes it seems like this. In fact, the necessity of an agency perspective is predicated on structural inequality, as we can see from the other categories in which it's so often mobilized. Analyses focused on structural material inequalities also therefore engage with questions of human agency. And Walter Rodney, in his classic book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, noted in the introduction that his approach did not rule out the significance of African agency in world history. Recent work has, like Olufemi Taiwo's provocative book Against Decolonization, centered the importance of African agency and the lack of attention to it in decolonizing approaches, even when noticing the importance of this agency and then fighting cumulative impacts of inequality. Nevertheless, when it comes to questions of structural inequality and agency, one or the other framework is generally given a greater accent. And in the past 2 decades of African studies in the West, I think everybody who is in the field would recognize that the agency framework has certainly had the upper hand in the balance of factors shaping analysis. And of course, various factors push this outcome. Firstly, of course, the collapse of the communist governments of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe meant that materialist analyses like Walter Rodney's, Emmanuel Wallersteiner's and others, which focused on questions of inequality, fell out of fashion. Secondly, of course, there were the infamous newspaper headlines like the Economist's May 13th, 2000 cover, The Hopeless Continent, which led to scholars and students calling time on the misrepresentation of Africa in that way. Then in the UK, where I'm based, controversies around the bicentennial of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 2007 added to this with a sustained discourse ensuring that the history of Africa and of Africans was not portrayed as starting and ending with slavery, exploitation, and dispossession. However, a further factor, which isn't so often acknowledged, was the way in which the concept of agency fitted with neoliberal frameworks of personal choice, of autonomy, which themselves, of course, represent a Randian approach to the individual and the state, which almost always leads to structurally racist outcomes. As the historian Walter Johnson pointed out in a much-read essay on agency, this in turn derived from the concept's basis in Enlightenment frameworks of autonomy and the individual. Agency thus could contribute to a focus on individuality and humanity, so often missing from quantitative frameworks in their focus on African history. But it could also, almost through a function of a Trojan horse, enable the spread of neoliberal ideologies leading to the erosion of state security nets and promoting inequality. This is an internal contradiction which is rarely acknowledged, but I think we'll see tonight, and my hope is that we will discuss this. It may be important in understanding elements of the response of academia to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm now going to share my presentation. The neoliberal concepts that dominate the Western university around student choice, autonomy, vulnerability, harm, resilience, make it almost inevitable that as scholars, we will reproduce these concepts in our research. And this is not something confined to the West, as Mahmoud Mandani famously noted, it's also something that's taking place in Africa. My concern tonight is in considering the material and academic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic response, as this title suggests. Those of you who follow my Twitter feed will not be surprised to hear that I shall argue that this was an irredeemably neo-colonial and unscientific policy, which has had immensely regressive economic, gendered, medical, and social consequences in Africa. And yet, on the other hand, this incontrovertible reality has not been much remarked upon by scholars in the West. Given the averred focus of the 21st century Western Academy on decolonization, reversing inequality, how can this be? How have Western academic concepts also been deployed to interrogate and debate such catastrophic outcomes? Is decolonization discourse only in fact aimed at Western universities and debate, something quietly to be passed over when neocolonialism in Africa hove into view? My concern tonight is to demonstrate the neocolonial and unscientific nature of the imposed COVID response in Africa, and also to understand the intellectual process which led to the response of the Academy to COVID-19 pandemic policies. I want to explore in detail first why the response imposed from supranational organizations such as the WHO was neocolonial and unscientific in Africa, and second, what the socioeconomic consequences have been on the continent. And then in the final part of the lecture, I'm going to explore the dissonance between academic responses in Africa and the West, pointing to some of the intellectual consequences which this has. On February 24, 2020, WHO published a report based on its fact-finding mission to Wuhan in China. This found that to reduce COVID-19 illness and death, near-term readiness planning must embrace the large-scale implementation of high-quality, non-pharmaceutical public health measures such as case detection and isolation and contact tracing and monitoring and quarantining. Countries with confirmed cases, as you see, any countries with imported cases, were immediately to activate the highest level of national response management protocols to ensure the all-of-government and all-of-society approach. It was thus the WHO's recommendation, published in this report, that all countries, regardless of socioeconomic conditions or housing composition, should follow the lockdown measures which had been imposed in Wuhan. This was, however, contrary to the findings of its November 2019 report, entitled, as you see, Non-Pharmaceutical Public Health Measures for Mitigating the Risk and Impact of Epidemic and Pandemic Influenza, as I say, published in November 2019, just 3 months before. This report had noticed, under ethical considerations, the human right to freedom of movement should be considered, as should potential adverse economic impacts, particularly in vulnerable populations, such as migrant workers. Although the WHO did not specifically call for a global lockdown, as Alex Broadbent and Peter Stryker had noted, they, quote, implicitly endorsed it in various ways. For example, by praising leaders of low-income countries who had lockdown, by making global recommendations about the standards that should be met before governments relax restrictions, implying a presumption in favour of restrictions. These policies may have been top-down and contraindicated by previous WHO research, but how effective were they in an African context? The fact is that the country assessed on the continent to have had the strictest lockdown policies in Africa was South Africa. And as you see, South Africa recorded far and away the highest number of COVID deaths, 102,595 out of a total with nearly 260,000, almost 40% of the total. Nor was this relationship of lockdowns and mortality outcomes confined to the African continent. Peru in South America, which had the world's strictest lockdowns in March 2020, today has the highest per capita death rates anywhere in the world from COVID-19 at 6,595 deaths per million people. This is not an indication of success. And we will now see why these policies in an African setting, far from preventing risk, were far more likely to exacerbate it and produce these appalling health outcomes on the continent when it comes to COVID. In their important paper, Can We Lock Down in the Slum?, Broadbent and Stryker note that the modelled epidemiological benefits of reducing social contacts through lockdowns took no account of differing living conditions for the world's poor. As they note, in Accra, over 50% of the population lives in a single-room dwelling. In such a context, even if departures from the home are greatly restricted, overall social contact will remain high due to the number of people in each home. As this suggests, in fact, in the informal settlements of Johannesburg, of Lagos, of Kinshasa, of Accra, confining people to live indoors through quarantine measures increases infectivity through overcrowding. This is because, owing to the crowded nature of housing, most people spend the bulk of their time outside. As the Sierra Leonean medical scholar Al-Haji Njai noted in this Sierra Leone Telegraph article from January 2021. Forcing people to observe quarantines or curfews, cramming them indoors after dark, is actually going to increase and not reduce social contact. This was observed in Mumbai during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic by the economist Andrew Malani. Malani described the situation in the Mumbai slum of Dahadi. While the probability of transmission from one household member to another in the West can be as low as 0.2, it's likely much greater in slums because everyone is always in the same room. On top of that, homes and slums have no ventilation, so everyone is breathing everyone else's air without filtration. Indeed, it's possible that lockdown increased the number of people slum residents interacted with on a typical day. On a typical day, a person may leave to go to school or work. During that period, they would experience the same level of interaction with others that non-slum residents typically experience. The real crowding happens when they come home. The lockdown kept slum residents at home all day, meaning they experienced maximum density all day, not just at night. This was confirmed by the seroprevalence tests which Malani's team conducted in Dharavi, comparing to the outcomes in more affluent housing settings. During the first months of the pandemic and the strict lockdown imposed by Narendra Modi in India, Malani's team found that seroprevalence in Dharavi was at 54.1% of those tested, while it was just at 16.1% outside in non-slum areas. This is clear proof that lockdowns increased seroprevalence of COVID-19 in informal settlements, which contributed to the terrible health outcomes in countries such as South Africa and Peru. Lockdowns increased COVID-19 spread in areas of overcrowded housing, and the touted goal of eradicating COVID completely was simply infeasible in such areas, meaning that the idea of zero COVID in Western countries, even if theoretically achievable, which is highly debatable, could only, even theoretically, have been achieved through complete global segregation of rich and poor countries, one of the most regressive policies imaginable. Not only was lockdown unscientific in terms of reducing virus spread, but it was also, from a public health point of view, unscientific through its failure to address the social determinants of health and the link between demographics and disease risk. In 1975, the demographer and health economist Samuel Preston described a clear relationship between wealth and life expectancy through a relation now known as the Preston curve. This showed that where GDP is high and countries are rich, Spain, Italy, France, Japan, the Netherlands, increases in GDP have little impact on life expectancy. The correlation was that the touted choice of saving lives or the economy was very different in low-income countries. In Africa, shutting down the economy through lockdown measures was something known by health economists to cause lowering life expectancies and poor health outcomes, because in poor countries, small increases in GDP have a dramatic impact on increased life expectancy. Moreover, COVID-19 was known from the outset to be particularly dangerous to the elderly. With its much younger demographic, some scientists noted in March 2020 that Africa was likely to be far less exposed. As this article from Science magazine reported, Sub-Saharan Africa has one major advantage when it comes to COVID-19. Its average age is the lowest in the world. The median age is less than 20, March the 15th, 2020. In other words, the aim of suppressing the virus spread not only was imposed on pontifically, but took no account of relative disease risk and the likely impacts of poverty on other health outcomes. Clearly an unscientific approach. The nail in the coffin of following the science through lockdowns in the African context is that it was already known that lockdowns were a failed policy in Africa. They'd been trialled in Freetown and Monrovia during the Ebola epidemic of 2014-2015. At the time, highly respected organisations like Médecins Sans Frontières warned, as you see, that they wouldn't help, as the BBC reported. Subsequent research confirmed this analysis. Riots had been provoked in Monrovia, with The Guardian, as you see here, reporting one resident of West Point, Patrick Wesse, as saying, "It is inhumane. They can't suddenly lock us up without warning. How are our children going to eat?" However, what was inhumane in 2014 became the height of progressive thinking by 2020. The unscientific nature of the COVID response in Africa is one side of the coin, the other side of which is the manifestly neo-colonial nature of this response. Throughout the colonial era, medicine was experienced in Africa in clear relationship with colonial force, as I discussed with some graduate students this afternoon. This occurred through the imposition of cordon sanitaire, as with COVID-19, and the testing of experimental drugs, including new vaccines such as the oral polio vaccine trials in Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda in the late 1950s. Colonial power required the control of the bodies of colonial subjects, and Western medicine was thereby deeply implicated in this relationship. It should hardly, therefore, be a surprise to scholars that these relationships were reinvigorated during a global health emergency, and that, as the South African sociologist Leslie Bank and Nellie Sharples wrote in their book on the pandemic in the rural Cape, what followed was a model of neo-colonial state capture. But the neo-colonial aspect did not just stop at the imposition by external actors such as WHO of these clearly unscientific policies. It continued through vaccine delivery. However, not as usually reported in the West. Analysts and scientists railed in Western journals and media against vaccine apartheid, but the experience on the ground was somewhat different. As I explored with those who were in the masterclass with graduate students this afternoon, the Ghanaian historian of medicine, Samuel Adejiamfi, noted that the neo-colonial approach instead continued through the ways in which Ghanaians were lined up by politicians at Accra Airport to dance in celebration at the arrival of the first batches of COVID vaccines. They were also embedded in the vaccine procurement framework through World Bank loans, which were given to many African countries to help fund access to the COVID vaccines, as I wrote in an article a couple of years ago. As a senior Gambian government official said in an interview last year, this continued with the pressure applied by Western embassies on the ground to vaccinate those working in the tourist industry, without which tourism would not return. Writing in the cable, Nigerian journalist Tope Fasua summarised the ways in which the COVID vaccine programme was connected to a broader neo-colonial approach to public health in Africa. As he noted, the unilateral focus on vaccines was itself neo-colonial, for it ignored African traditions of medicine and healing, which many have used throughout the pandemic, and which many African specialists credit with some success. We did say then, when this problem was at its peak, that African nations be allowed to have a say, and that we may have some antidotes that are not available in the West. The way we were shut down spoke to open racism and a desire by a few to profiteer from other people's misfortunes as they positioned to sell vaccines to the world. Moreover, the unilateral focus on COVID-19 to the exclusion of other health conditions was itself neo-colonial. This was, after all, a disease far less likely, as the science article said, to be of serious concern in Africa. Yet, according to one Mozambican doctor in an article from mid-2021, all other childhood vaccinations had been halted in Mozambique at the time. And in an interview I conducted with the sociologist from Mozambique, Pedrito Cambrao, in March 2022, he told me that that remained the case 2 years after the start of the pandemic. All other vaccination programs had been halted in Mozambique. Broader neo-colonial impacts came from the excessive focus on testing in Western nations, where we were told that testing was the way out of the pandemic. And yet those tests, as this BMJ article from July 2020 shows, were provided by companies which traditionally had made malaria rapid tests, but diversified out into COVID tests, which are much more profitable, leading to severe shortages of these tests and other routine drugs, such as antipsychotics by the middle of 2020. And in a discussion with an senior Nigerian medic last year, he told me that there remained a shortage of rapid tests in Nigerian medicine at that time. So to summarize this section of the lecture, what we've seen is that the COVID-19 pandemic policy response followed a traditional colonial or neo-colonial model. African models of healthcare were mocked and discarded in favour of expensive Western biomedical systems, which are entirely unscientific in the African context, and rooted when it came to vaccines and models of debt dependency. This was also done to target a disease which, while a concern in the West, was far less likely to be a major issue in a continent with Africa's demographics. That doesn't sound like a classic case of neocolonialism, then I'm not a historian of Africa. So moving on to the next part of the lecture, when it comes to the neocolonial impacts, it's important to move beyond just purely medical questions to socioeconomic dimensions. And what transpired was an economic firestorm, which many here will be aware of, which led to the new era of austerity, which is in this evening's lecture's title. This is an era which has reversed decades of economic improvement that had led to the 2010s being dubbed the era of Africa Rising, as some of you will remember. And all that has today vanished from the headlines. As you see, the African Forum on Network on Debt and Development reported about 6 months ago that new figures showed debt service of developing countries were at their highest ever level. These reports have been continuing throughout the last 18 months or so. Ghana's debt, Zambia's and Ethiopia's were all restructured last year. There were hunger marches, as some of you will know, in Nigeria throughout January and February because of the fuel subsidies which were removed by the new Nigerian government. It's not surprising that some have called this, such as the New Internationalists, the beginning of structural adjustment 2.0. But this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, and least of all to the IMF. Because consistently throughout the COVID pandemic, the IMF emphasized that its COVID loans were tied to future programs of austerity. In August 2021, Oxfam reported that in the first year of the pandemic, 85% of the 107 COVID loans negotiated by the IMF were tied to future promises of austerity. The same model continued in 2022, with Oxfam's finding that 13 of the 15 loan programs negotiated in the second year of the pandemic required future austerity. And this, of course, is going to impact public spending. Sure enough, in October 2022, The Guardian reported that an Oxfam report had found that half of the world's low-income countries had cut health spending since 2020. The same report from Oxfam noted that half the countries tracked cut the share of social protection spending, 70% cut the share of education spending. The latest projections from October 2023 are that 57% of low-income countries will have to cut their public spending by a combined $229 billion over the next 5 years. It's worth pausing to let that sink in. Far from protecting health for all, the COVID policies took a sledgehammer to public health, social security, and education policies across the global south, especially in Africa. And all of it was in clear sight, baked into the emergency loans from the IMF produced in 2020, as the Oxfam reports had shown. And all that is with regard to the future effects produced by this debt mountain. We haven't even considered yet the immediate impacts of the pandemic response on the continent. The socioeconomic impacts of the unscientific nature of the COVID policy in Africa linked to both impoverishment and especially to gender-based violence. The connections between the two were discussed in this article, which I co-authored with the Gambian historian Hassan Site in August last year, and its links to food security. In this article, one of the things we discussed were how harvests were lost in the Gambia during the shutdowns because transport restrictions prevented seeds being taken to growing sites in the key phase before the rains. They prevented the planting of crops. In another interview I conducted with the sociologist from Benguela in Angola, Elsa Rodriguez, Elsa also described how in rural areas of Angola, farmers were barred from going to their fields, even when there were no COVID cases in the locality, meaning they also lost their crops, and contributing to a notable increase in prostitution in the city of Benguela. So these impacts of the loss of food security were immense, and particularly contributed to these terrible gendered impacts. An example is Uganda, where families could no longer afford to feed their adolescent girls, and desperation and poverty increased instances of abuse. Schools were closed in Uganda for 2 years. In a shocking report written by Kakawenza Wikira Bashaisha in 2021, he wrote that if we were to add results from all the districts in the country, we'd find that more than 80% of schoolgirls in the whole country will not be going back to school due to pregnancies. A total of 354,736 teenage pregnancies were registered in 2020, nearly 200,000 in the first 6 months of 2021. Some of the young girls have already given birth twice ever since schools were closed 2 years ago. How accurate was that estimate? According to Ugandan Radio in November 2021, the near 2-year closure of schools, which was also such a major part of this crisis, took 4.5 million children out of education, not 80%, an enormous impact. As the Uganda National Planning Agency report made clear, the gender dimension of this catastrophe, they estimated that a 19 to 20% increase in the number of young girls becoming breadwinners for families, among two others, sexual exploitation, child labour, and early marriages. Here we're confronted with this one case study in Uganda of the immensity. So this is just Uganda, of what the UN has described as the shadow pandemic. In a report for Drexel University College of Medicine, Dr. Christiana Obey noted that according to the UN, before the pandemic, 243 million women and girls were victims of sexual and physical violence. Since the pandemic, this number has risen to 736 million women and children. That's almost 500 million people. A report by UN Women makes stark reading. 45% of women said they knew of a woman who had experienced violence since the start of the pandemic. 1 in 4 said household conflicts had increased and they felt more unsafe at home. 3 in 10 said that violence against women had increased across their community. And in this report from UN Women, as you see, 80% of women in Kenya reported that they or women they knew experienced a form of violence against women since the COVID-19 pandemic. It was 48% in Nigeria. This injunction to stay safe, stay at home, gave little thought to the fact that safety depends on the nature of the household and the gender of those involved. Enormous pressures produced by collapsing incomes were inevitably going to lead to such outcomes. A peculiar act of brainwashing declared that these policies were safe. Food insecurity produced by the shutdown restrictions also contributed directly to the current socioeconomic crisis across the continent. The sudden increase in hunger also required governments to invest in support packages through the COVID loan schemes developed by the IMF and World Bank. Early in the crisis, Nigeria, for example, was loaned $3.4 billion, about half of the Nigerian annual budget, in April 2020 by the IMF. This was the beginning of the African sovereign debt crisis, which has continued ever since. Now, many economists have sought to pin the blame for this crisis on the fact that they claim that there was an over-leveraging of projected growth during the 2010s and that loans increased out of hand. Now, in Nigeria, for example, under President Buhari, there was a tripling of foreign loans, and across the continent as the whole long-term debt doubled during the 2010s. So, according to that macroeconomic playbook, this is case closed. Increasing indebtedness led to the current debt crisis, just as happened in the 70s or the oil. But the 70s, for me, is an interesting case of comparison, because then, as in the 2010s, debt increase projected against the future growth of African economies. Increasing projected future assets were used as security to develop infrastructure needed to kickstart development. I mean, the 2010s, as I've mentioned, this was the era of Africa rising. Ethiopia, as the FT reported, was the fastest growing country in the world in the 2010s. Many others weren't far behind it. There was optimism that increased growth could lead to future development. And so this was not economic profligacy. This was based on future returns, which all economists would project to the continent. And it was widely discussed by economists how accurate and how optimistic one could be about Africa rising. Widely discussed not so long ago. Seems like a long time ago. So what caused this reversal? Many in the West point to the impact of the war in Ukraine on inflation and inevitable and unavoidable consequences of the COVID pandemic. However, there's a lot to dispute this, not least this report from Thomson Reuters from June 2021, 9 months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which found that soaring food prices were squeezing family budgets around the world. The UN report from the same month found that food prices were then at their highest for a decade. As we've seen, harvests were lost in 2020 in many countries on the continent because of transport restrictions and other movement restrictions. This clearly contributed to this outcome. And that's actually confirmed by a number of reports from across the continent. This is a report from South Africa, December 2020. Lockdowns forced nearly half of small businesses in South Africa to close. It's instructive to compare this economic devastation with the situation in Tanzania, which famously, under the late President John Magufuli, did not follow recommended COVID protocols. Reports from Tanzania show that the country's economy grew in 2020 by around 5%. A stark contrast to the situation in other African countries, where the average economic loss in GDP loss was much closer to 5%. Since, as we've already seen through the Preston curve, in poor countries, GDP is connected to life expectancy, there can be no doubt that Magufuli's policy saved and prolonged many lives. And moreover, this evidence makes it clear that it was the unscientific and neocolonial lockdown policy and associated economic shock which began the intensification of impoverishment. And this is all but confirmed by the African Development Bank's report from 2019, which you see here, which projected growth of 4.5%, as the Tanzanian model managed to confirm, in fact, following year. No mainstream economists at that time were predicting that over-leveraged debt was going to lead to a massive economic collapse and austerity. Nobody. To summarize, massive socioeconomic harms were caused by the neocolonial lockdown policies in Africa. The costs in lost education, gender-based violence, impoverishment, and lowered life expectancies are incalculable. And these policies also produced a mountain of debt, baking in further austerity and inequality for a decade. When some declare that decades of work in reducing inequality were lost, we get a sense of what is meant. These distressing findings now bring me to the final part of the lecture, which is to seek to understand the dissonance in academic responses between Africa and the West. Because bizarrely, shockingly, given what's unfolded in this lecture, much of the public discourse that initially emerged in the Western academy and commentariat around COVID in Africa portrayed the response as a success. Why are Africa's coronavirus successes being overlooked? Asked Afra Hirsch in The Guardian on May 21st, 2020. Countries like Senegal had begun their COVID response early in January, according to Hirsch, while Ghana's system of contact tracing was bearing dividends. How could this possibly be presented as a success? The roots of this apparent success were the low numbers of deaths from COVID-19 being experienced in Africa. As Professor Megan Vaughan from UCL put it in her Stephen Ellis lecture in this very institution 18 months ago, quote, many African countries apparently not only suffered less illness and death, but also demonstrated an impressive ability to manage this major public health crisis. And these mortality figures do look impressive when compared to the rest of the world. As we saw, the total numbers of death registered from COVID in Africa was around 260,000. The WHO estimated 6 out of 7 cases in Africa went unreported, but of course, cases are more likely to go unreported than deaths. Several studies suggest that between 30 and 80% of deaths were reported. So if we take that around 60%, so let's say 40% of as an average, more or less. From that 260,000, we could extrapolate to say perhaps a mortality of 600,000 is a reasonable estimate. That would be 300,000 per year at the height of the pandemic, which is less than a 3% mortality increase on a continent where nearly 12 million people died in 2023. Certainly far lower than excess mortality in many Western countries, but there is a different way to look at this success, as we've seen tonight, which is that with a median age of 19.8 in 2020, according to the Ibrahim Foundation, COVID-19 was never likely to be a major health concern on the continent. And this meant that the one-size-fits-all quarantine policy recommended never made sense, scientifically as we've seen, but it didn't make sense either in terms of African health priorities and needs. But African needs were never foremost in this kind of planning. In a recent article in The Guardian, Debbie Srida told a revealing story about a meeting that she arranged on pandemic preparedness in 2019. It reminds me of a meeting we held in 2019 at Edinburgh University on how best to convince low and middle-income countries to take pandemic preparedness seriously. The response from ministers in these countries was that they were more concerned with getting basic healthcare to their populations rather than face up to the prospect of existential threats. What Srida apparently failed to grasp was that in low-income countries, lack of basic healthcare and the means to provide it is an existential threat. By contrast, it's significant to note that scholars based in Africa were well aware of this problematic very early on in the pandemic. An open letter from African intellectuals to African leaders was published in Al Jazeera on April 17, 2020, signed by figures including Wole Soyinka, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Amilcar Cabral's daughter Eva Cabral and Francis Nyamjo, the letter noted what had been happening in Africa since the widespread adoption of the policies in March, adopting the all-securitarian model of containment of northern countries, often without much care to specific context. Many African countries have imposed a brutal lockdown upon their populations. Here and there, violation of curfew measures has been met with police violence. If such containment measures have met the agreement of middle classes shielded from crowding living conditions, with some having the possibility to work from home, they've proved punitive and disruptive for those whose survival depends on informal activities. Just a few days earlier, on April the 13th, Mozambican sociologist Alicia Macamo had published a powerful essay on the different approaches to risk of Africans and Europeans. As he noted astutely, the Western model of COVID risk aversion presented an approach built on colonial history. The imperative to minimize risk derived from the externalization of risks and losses onto colonial subjects as the other side of the coin of the creation of stable consumers on the back of the domination of colonial subjects. The sociology of risk does not mention this, as you see at the top there, but there is a colonial dimension to taming of risk in Europe. Macamo's analysis was also sanguine as to the risks which the all-securitarian lockdown model posed in Africa. Africans have always responded to crises by appealing to their vibrant social safety nets for protection and action. This is not a romantic view of the continent, it's a pragmatic acknowledgement of the continent's real situation, one to which Africans have responded in resilient ways, even if at great human cost. Lockdowns, at least theoretically, weaken these safety nets by depriving individuals both of sources of livelihood as well as of opportunities for bonding. As we've seen in this lecture, this prediction effectively has been borne out by events, clear to Macamo early in April 2020. Not something that became apparent in hindsight. And the consequences have been recently considered in a seminar given at the University of Lagos by Professor Toyin Falola on April the 5th, less than a month ago. Many will know in this room that Toyin Falola has a good claim to be the most distinguished historian of Africa alive today. Discussing the socioeconomic impacts of the last few years, Falola said, creating a lockdown in Africa for a sickness that many Africans are naturally resistant to is unnecessary, and could worsen the situation. It'll be an attempt to indirectly damage Africa and force it to rely on the charity of foreign powers to survive. The African economies are still reeling from the tremendous losses that followed. The question of whether Africa's low income monopoly is part of the argument. Nonetheless, if any lockdown measures are implemented, they will have little opportunity to become high income or maintain satisfactory economic positions. Many of the world's leading intellectuals from Africa have therefore taken public positions on the COVID pandemic response and the prospect for future similar responses to be voted on in the World Health Assembly later this month. Falola likens this to, quote, an incident that is comparable to colonialism. And in such circumstances, it is to be expected that worldwide scholars of African studies will deploy relevant frameworks to indict this neocolonialism. But in many cases, the academic literature on COVID in Africa has instead reproduced the agency-dominated tropes, which I discussed in the introduction to this lecture. Emphasis on Africa's vaccine diplomacy builds on histories of diplomacy and agency by African political leaders. Discussion of the socioeconomic impacts of the new normal relate devastating experiences to fragilities associated with literatures on precarity and resilience in the era of globalization. Much of the literature focuses on core concepts like vulnerability. All of these concepts related to the expansion of neoliberal frameworks of indebtedness and inequality in the 21st century, after all. Indeed, as I argue with Thomas Faxi in our book, which was mentioned at the start, precisely what's been lacking in so much of the response to COVID-19 in an academic sense is a structural critique of neoliberal capitalism. And this is curious, since the response model so clearly follows that which was set out by Naomi Klein in her famous book on disaster capitalism, The Shock Doctrine, and in another book, very popular in recent years, Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Clearly, as I've argued tonight, and although both Klein and Zuboff went missing in action during COVID times, externalized shocks were used during the pandemic to engineer massive profiteering and impoverishment as losses were outsourced to the global poor in Africa. This was imposed through surveillance techniques, the capacity of new technologies to enable remote work, and the accumulation of economic value to the digital economy. I would argue that this, and not discursive approaches to questions of precarity, resilience, and vulnerability, should have been at the heart of an intellectual riposte to this disaster. As Falola, Macamo, and the open letter which I've cited indicate, and as we've seen, these concepts completely fail to address the neo-colonial nature of the pandemic response. I would argue further that in a theoretical sense, they indicate that the primacy of the agency model, which, as I said at the beginning, has been dominant for 20 years or more within the academia, over its symbiotic twin of structural material inequality, failed Africa during the pandemic. That primacy must be finished. And this should not really be a surprise, because as I also discussed in the introduction, this model draws on neoliberal concepts of selfhood, as well as on the need to foreground individuality and autonomy. This intellectual contradiction played out in 2020 and 2021, and the desire to show agency meant that there was a difficulty for calling this what it was, a neo-colonial and unscientific assault on the African poor. Coming to terms with this failure means coming to terms with the ways in which Western academic thinking has been captured by neoliberal concepts, which normalize economic inequality, while punishing those who might turn to materialist analysis. Within this approach, concepts such as resilience, precarity, and vulnerability are ways of gaming the system. In fact, of normalizing and aggravating the vulnerability, which in 2020 we were told it was perhaps only theoretically our duty to protect. Including frameworks of decolonization is also important in this approach, but what possible value do these critiques hold if they remain virtually silent on probably the biggest neocolonial assault on Africa since independence? Is decolonization something that only fit for the polite circles of the Western Academy? I haven't been very polite this evening, and I'm grateful to be given the opportunity to have given this talk in the Netherlands, which, if I know of Dutch culture, I'm sure I can expect a robust response. At times, we have to make an attempt to reach beyond the interest of the profession and the discursive concepts that underpin it. We have to seek to understand the material frameworks which enable the permacrisis of our neoliberal setting. Of course, the fragility imposed on Western middle classes by neoliberalism and the new era of surveillance capitalism itself further encourages scholars to play this game or risk being left behind in the wastelands outside of institutional frameworks, profiteering from the new war economy as discourse moves from the war on COVID to the war in Ukraine to the war on Gaza. In their recent book, Reconomics, highly recommended, Ruben Anderson and David Keane show how this framework can all be seen as part of the same war. They show how academic frameworks themselves are part of the new war economies in which crises generate massive corporate profits and institutional inertia as well. In this way, crisis becomes institutionally part of the academic world too. And to conclude, and I'm very grateful for your patience, this framework may best explicate the response of Western academia to what I've shown, I hope this evening, to be the criminal nature of the imposed pandemic response in Africa.